Welcome to this absolute beginner's guide to watercolour techniques and watercolour materials. So when you go out and buy your paints, you have to decide whether you want tubes or pans. So this is the box of pans, and you get a variety of colours. But as a beginner, you don't need to have this many colours, and sometimes that can be daunting. But here is a little pan, and you get a little cake of paint in there. I like to buy tube paint. So once I've finished with my pans, I don't usually replace them with pans. I replace them with tubes. So I'm squeezing out maybe the same colour or a similar colour to replace the pan that has run out. The reason why I like tubes is because I can get access to sort of lots of paint to make large washes. And as you can see, I'm just replenishing a pan there with some tubed paint. Now, if you've been given a present of a box of paints, or you've got pans and they get a little bit dry, just use a spritzer bottle and spray them about half an hour before you use them, because that does moisten up panned paint or dried tube paint, and it's easier to use them afterwards. So I'm going to talk about my recommended colours and whether you should buy artist or student quality. I've been teaching watercolour for many years, and if you're starting out and you have a very limited budget, all you need is 3 primary colours, an old white dinner plate, a jam jar, some watercolour paper, and just one brush with some paper towel to get started. My recommended colours are a little bit of lemon yellow or cadmium yellow pale, some alizarin crimson or carmine, or any pink will do, permanent rose, and a little bit of ultramarine or cerulean blue or cobalt blue. So you can actually mix so many colours just using these 3 colours. As you can see here, I'm mixing a little bit of green with the blue and yellow, and then I'm going to mix a little bit of the yellow with the pink to make an orange. And finally, I will mix the blue and the pink together to make a violet. So that's the sort of very basic colour mixing. I will put a link in the description below of a very in-depth tutorial I published all about colour mixing. So if you want to add more colours to your palette, I'm just demonstrating in this sort of Sketchers little watercolour box here for travelling mainly, or little pen and wash sketches, some of the colours that I recommend. And whether it be artists or students will all depend on your budget. With student qualities, there's more binder, and with artist qualities, there is more pigment, so you're paying for the pigment. And yes, they are better quality, but if you're starting out on a budget, the student quality watercolour paints are really good, especially the Winsor & Newton and Daler Rowney student variety, and I'll put a link for those in the description below. But I'm just mixing up some yellows here to the left. It's a lemon yellow and a cadmium yellow. I've got a yellow ochre and a raw sienna. I'd recommend only just one of those, and even just one yellow. I've got some burnt sienna and burnt umber, and now I'm painting in some viridian and some Hooker's green light. I'd actually say you don't need any of those greens there, and I would say just one brown. So I will put a link in the description below of the colours I feel that are necessary when you're starting out. It's fun to just use the 3 primary colours, but it's quite nice to have a brown in there as well, and an earthy yellow, and maybe a red as well. So these are my pinks here, permanent rose and alizarin crimson. I'm now painting with some quinacridone red. Again, only one pink is necessary when you're starting out. It's quite nice to have a variety of colours, but it can prove a little bit confusing and somewhat daunting. This is some cadmium red, so it's quite nice to have a slightly warmer red, a poppy coloured red as I call them. So a permanent rose and a cadmium red would be really useful. Just one yellow, maybe a lemon or a cadmium yellow pale, a yellow ochre or a raw sienna, or even a quinacridone gold. This is a little bit of Prussian blue, and now I'm painting on with some cobalt blue. It is useful to have a Prussian blue or a turquoise, but when you've got the cobalt or ultramarine, you can just stick with one of those. I'd recommend ultramarine because I love ultramarine, but cobalt blue is a really good substitute. This little clip here is part of a more in-depth tutorial where I discuss watercolor boxes and palettes, and I'll put a link for that in the description below. So I'm just mixing some Payne's grey here and some black. I would say if you're going to decide between those two, I'd go for the Payne's grey. You can also make an artist looking Payne's grey by mixing up ultramarine and burnt sienna, so you don't even need Payne's grey. But here's a close-up of the colours here, so it gives you a really good idea of the sort of choices out there. So from the left, I'd pick one of those yellows. Next to those earthy yellows, again they're quite similar, I'd choose one of those. You've got light red there, burnt sienna and burnt umber, sort of more browny sort of colours. I'd go in the middle there with the burnt sienna. And I would skip out the greens. You can make your own greens. So bottom left there, I'd go for the permanent rose, and then moving along there for the fourth little square at the bottom there, the cadmium red, and then the Prussian blue beside it. And then on the square number 7, which is the ultramarine, so I've skipped the cobalt blue. I love that colour. It's very, very useful. And besides that, the Payne's grey. And they would be my recommended 8 colours for beginners when you are starting out in watercolour painting. And I will give you a full list of those colours and alternative colours to those in the description below. So on to brushes. There are a vast variety of brushes out there. It can be so confusing. I would say the most important thing is to buy soft haired brushes and brushes that you can afford. And the reason why they've got to be soft haired is because you don't want them to disturb the paint underneath when you're painting in layers in watercolour, because watercolour isn't permanent. So if you use a very stiff bristle brush, it will disturb the paint underneath. So there's lots of soft haired brushes out there. There are synthetic blends. That's a natural hair brush blended with synthetic hair. And there are natural haired brushes. I tend to use black velvet brushes by Silverbrush, and I'll put a link for those in the description below. But there are a lot of good brushes out there that will suit different budgets, and I'll put a link for those in the description below. I'd also recommend buying short handle brushes. A lot of the times in watercolour we don't tend to paint standing up at an easel because that angle makes the paint all run down. You find artists that work standing up at an easel have long handle brushes. In watercolour we tend to be maybe sitting down closer to our work, so I would recommend short handled brushes. I'd also recommend buying a large sort of mop brush or a flat brush like the brush I have on the left, a worker sort of brush, which is the brush I have on the right, which is a size 10, and a small detailer brush like the size 4 that I have in the middle here. I will put a full list of the brushes that I recommend in the description below, along with links where you can purchase them. So I'm going to talk about simple brush techniques. So I would say the most important thing is always load your brush with plenty of paint. I'm using the tip of my round brush here. It's a size 8. You can use a size 10 as well. And I'm getting thin lines. Now I'm loading that brush and sort of letting more of the brush hair sort of touch the paper, and you get thicker lines as well. Glide your brush across the paper. Remember, you may have paint underneath that could be disturbed. Now I'm really loading my brush. I'm going to paint a larger area of paint. So I'm filling in more like a flat wash, which I will talk and discuss later. So I'm using a dry brush technique here. I've taken the excess liquid off on my paper towel, and I'm using the belly of the brush, which I'm pointing to there. So you don't use the tip, which I was using earlier, use the belly of the brush. And this gives you some lovely textured effects. As you can see there, it's very useful, especially in landscape painting where you want lots of texture. The other thing I want to sort of say is keep your wrist very loose and free. Try to hold your brush further down the handle so you feel like you're painting. Look at that lovely sort of free strokes. It really loosens you up as well. Remember, you're painting and not drawing. So what brush to choose? For a small area, a small brush. And really load your brush and just fill in that small area. I would also recommend a large brush for a small area if you want to paint loose. So a large area, large brush. Do not use a small brush in a large area. You'll get lots of streaking and you come into all sorts of problems. So really load your brush every single time. And again, as I said, small area, large brush as well is really useful. But as you can see, I've got a seamless wash there in that large area. So what paper to use, hot press, cold pressed or rough? It can be very daunting to know what to use. My first recommendation is get the right weight of paper. I recommend 300 grams, which this pad is. And as you can see there in brackets, it says 140 pounds. That's what it's equivalent to. So you may see just 140 pounds written. It means it's 300 grams. You'll also see it written white there. Don't have to worry about that too much, but just below it, it's the letters HP. That stands for hot press. That's a very smooth paper. The paper I recommend is cold press. That's CP. It also stands for not hot press, so it's got a bit of texture. It's perfect for beginners. I also recommend you getting 100% cotton paper because it doesn't dry as quickly, and especially for beginners it gives you more time, which is so important when you're starting out in watercolor. The last surface is a rough surface, which is lovely for loose expressive paintings here, and as you can see you get the same details. A 300 grams, 100% cotton, and it says it's a rough surface. So they're the things you would need to look out for when you are buying your watercolor paper. I thought it'd be useful to share with you the different surfaces and compare them painting the same subject. As you can see, the rough's very loose and the hot press is quite detailed, and you've got sort of a mixture of both with the cold pressed. Now when you decide on the size of your paper, I would suggest A4 or larger. That's a really good size, and you can buy watercolor paper in loose sheets and on watercolor block, as you can see here, or watercolor pads. I'd actually recommend loose sheet watercolor paper because you can actually cut them down to a size that suits you. What I'd like to include here is help when your paper warps or to prevent it warping. I like to use watercolor blocks. As you can see here, this is the Saunders Waterford watercolor block, and it's gummed all the way around the side except for a small gap where you place a knife in, as you can see I'm doing here, to release the paper. But you do this at the end of your painting, and you can see there all that gummed edge sort of prevents the paper from warping. If you are using very wet techniques though, I've got a solution for paper warping as well. As you can see there, I've shown you it's all gummed around the edge, and I'm just going to show you how to release the paper. I usually use a plastic palette knife, and I just go all carefully around the edge. As you can see, I'm just releasing the watercolor paper. Make sure your knife is clean because you don't want to dirty the new sheet underneath. But as you can see there, you just paint now again on top of there, and when you finish your painting, you again use your palette knife to release the paper for your next painting. Another way I like to work is to use a watercolor board like this. And I've got some framing tape here. You can use washi tape. Again, I'll have a list of materials in the description below, but I'm using the framing tape. I like to sort of use the tape a little bit like masking tape, but it's a bit kinder to watercolor paper. And I like to actually put it around my paper to give me a nice white border as well. It's a nice way of holding your paper as well, so it doesn't slip around. And it's one sort of slightly cheaper alternative that I encourage my students to do. So as you can see here, I'm wetting the paper in the usual way. You may get a little bit of warping there as well though by using the tape around the edge there, so that's one thing to look out for. If you don't like that and you want to stretch your watercolor paper, you can do this with gummed tape. So it's slightly different from the framing tape. It looks the same, so this one's a little bit wider, but you can get narrower gum tape. But to stretch your paper, you need to thoroughly soak your paper, and then you wet the gum tape, whereas the framing tape you stick straight on like masking tape. This, you wet the gum tape and then sort of put it on 50-50 onto your watercolor paper and onto your board and smooth it out. Because you've wet your watercolor paper, you've stretched it. Allow it to stretch a bit, and then the gum tape stretches with the watercolour paper. So as you can see here, I'm putting again about 50-50 onto the paper and onto the board. The reason why this is important is because you have too little on the paper. When the watercolour paper starts to stretch, it can pull away from that gum tape and stop it from being fully stretched. So as you can see here, the 50-50 works really well. So remember, you want to soak your watercolour paper for about a minute in clean cold water, not freezing water, and then sort of run all the excess liquid off, lay it onto an absorbent board. I've got a grey board here that's bigger than the watercolour paper, and then, as I say, 50-50, the gum strip here, the gum tape, 50-50 onto your watercolour paper and then the board, and allow it to dry naturally and lay it flat somewhere. And as you can see here now, it's thoroughly dried and it's stretched really nicely. And I should get no warping when I'm painting wet in wet now. Now, I don't normally stretch my watercolour paper just because of time constraints, and that's why I use the blocks. But if you have got the time, it's a lot cheaper alternative than actually buying the blocks. And the blocks still have a little bit of warping, especially if you paint very wet in wet. And when you finish your painting, you need to trim off with the scissors the gum tape. It's almost impossible to remove, and you may tear your paper by doing so. Another way of preventing warping is to wet the back and the front of the paper with clean water and use a non-absorbent board so that the paper doesn't dry out and the water doesn't soak into the board. Spend a little bit of time doing this, really give it a soak with a brush there, back and front. And while the back of the paper is still wet, the front will remain wet or damp. And this allows you to paint for a long time wet in wet without the worry of your painting drying out. What I usually do, if I think it's going to dry out a little bit, I usually wet the back of the paper again and the board, so it just stops the paper from drying out. And it really does give you the freedom to paint wet in wet, especially if you're that type of painter as well. And it's great for beginners. This is something I prepared earlier. So I've wet the back of this painting, and I've also masked out and let the masking fluid dry on this painting. And I'm wetting the back and the front now to really, what it does, it really stretches the paper. And while the paper is still wet and stuck to the board, the non-absorbent board, it stops it from warping, and it just allows you to paint freely. If you are interested in watching this real-time tutorial, check out the link in the description below. So now I'd like to talk about basic techniques. The paint consistency is so important. So I'm going to talk about watery paint, milky paint, creamy paint, and thick paint. So this is watery paint. Watery paint's important because it shows all the light colours and tonal values. So you want to really add lots of water so you can see the light of the paper being reflected through. Watercolour is a transparent medium, and we usually work light to dark. So what I'm doing now is I'm mixing up a milky consistency, and this is more for your light to mid tones. So you're building up light to mid tones in your painting, creating depth. And as you build up darker colours, you add more paint or darker colours. So less water, more paint, so it's a little bit more creamy in consistency, which this one is here. And you can see immediately the dark tonal values. And the last consistency is really quite a thick consistency, straight from the tube with barely any water. You still want the light of the paper to reflect through, otherwise it will make your painting look flat. But this is going to be your darkest dark, which I usually use towards the end of my painting. So here are the 4 consistencies that I use in my watercolour painting. And of course they vary slightly. So let's just try this with some different colours. So I'm using a little bit of pink here, and I'm going to paint the lightest tonal value first, this very watery consistency, so you can see the light of the paper being reflected through. This is the washes that you usually start with. And the other most important tonal value is, of course, the light of the paper. So don't forget that. And sometimes we mask that out or paint round it, and that'll be your lightest light. As you saw there, I painted my milky consistency. That's a light to mid-tone. And now I've added some more paint, less water for my creamy consistency. So I'm building now mid to darker tones. And this creates so much depth in a painting as well, and makes them look more 3D. The important thing is to let these washes dry in between the stages as well. This is the darkest dark, the thick consistency. You want to use this to a minimum. And remember, your lightest light is the white of the paper. And what I'm doing now is this very watery yellow, lots and lots of water. So you can see that lovely paper being reflected through there, the light of the paper. Milky consistency, a little bit more yellow, and these will be your light to mid tones there. Look at the difference just adding a bit more paint makes there. And I'm rinsing my brush now, adding a pinch more yellow, slightly creamier now, and this hides the light and white of the paper. This is why it makes it look darker as well. Not that yellow looks very dark. The other way you can get darker tonal values is by glazing and layering colours over one another as well. So these are my colours here, building up the tonal values. So they're the paint consistencies are so important. So practice those using different colours, and then maybe practice them mixing two colours together to get the lighter and darker tonal values. So more basic techniques here. So I'm talking about working wet into wet, damp into wet, damp into damp, and wet on dry. These are terms you're going to come across quite frequently. So let's start off with wet on dry. I'm using my size 8 brush. I've got some 300 grams cold pressed paper, my little jam jar of water there, and some ultramarine. And I've got wet paint, that's the wet, and I'm going to paint on the dry paper, that's the dry. So literally load your brush if you can, each brush stroke if you can. It might feel a little bit out of control, but it really does help sort of keep the paint from drying out, and you get these lovely, beautiful washes there. They don't look laboured or streaky, as you can see here. So that's my sort of flat wash there. I'm going to work wet on wet now. So the paint's still wet, you just have to wet the paper. So what happens is the consistency is about the same. The paint is wet, and you want to have the paper about as wet as the paint. So as you can see there, I've made plenty of paint. Always mix plenty of paint. Don't run out halfway through. I've taken the excess off on a paper towel. A really good tip to control the amount of paint on your brush. You can see I've got plenty of control there. And I'm painting wet into wet with my size 8 brush. You can see straight away it's all quite fuzzy, and the wet on dry is all crisp. You get crisp, hard edges. Wet into wet, you get sort of fuzzy edges. That can be very useful. It's unique about watercolour because it can make things look distant, and things that have got crisp hard edges can bring things closer. So again, you can create depth. So I'm mixing up a little bit of phthalo turquoise here, still using my size 8 brush. I'm working wet on dry. I'm just adding a bit more water there, painting a flat wash. You can see I'm actually painting 50-50 over the previous wash or the previous line of paint. That way you don't get streaking, which is really helpful. So I'm loading right down to the bottom here. As you can see, I'm always loading my brush. It really is key. So I'm going to paint damp into wet. So my paint isn't as wet as that turquoise. It's slightly milkier or slightly creamier. And that way you have a little bit of control and it won't run as much. So I'm loading my brush each time, but as you can see, the yellow kind of stays there. But what happens is when you paint damp into wet with another colour like yellow, it changes colour. So you're mixing the colours damp into wet on the paper as well. So it's quite useful for sort of soft edge marks, and it again creates depth in watercolour painting. So I've allowed my painting top right hand square to dry off a little, so the sheen is still there, which is important. I've mixed up some creamier paint, taken the excess off, and I'm painting damp into damp. So the paper is damp, there's still a shine there, but it's not really wet and shiny. and I'm taking that excess off each time. And what happens is there you get a more defined line with a soft edge. You get lots more control, especially taking the excess paint off on the paper towel. Do try to practice these techniques. It really will build confidence in your watercolor painting. So I'm going to move on to more basic washes this time: flat washes, graduated washes, and variegated washes. So let's start off with a flat wash. Nice, easy flat wash, and I'm painting this wet on dry. I'm going to also talk about avoiding backruns, cauliflowers and blooms. So as you can see here, I'm using plenty of paint, loading my brush each time. As you saw when I painted that ultramarine wash top left hand corner, I always started on the left hand side and painted. Here to avoid cauliflowers, which the top left hand ultramarine has got in the middle there. So to avoid that, start from the left, load your brush, and then start from the right, then again start from the left, and that way you don't get sort of build up of paint on one side. And the other way is to paint from a tilt where you've got a bead that's running down, so you can also control. I'm also tilting this sideways so I don't make sure I haven't got a puddle either side. So I always sometimes tilt my washes just to ensure that there's not a build up of paint. And look here, if you keep tilting, can you see there you're getting a little puddle? Sometimes if you leave that, it creeps back into the painting and causes a cauliflower. So I'm just tilting it here, waiting till it all collects into a little puddle here, and I'm just lifting off very carefully with the tip of my brush, letting it soak the paint off rather than lifting the paint off. I'm letting it touch the paint and lifting it off, and that will help avoid cauliflowers and blooms. Cauliflowers and blooms happen when wet paint runs into a drying wash, which is what happened here. There was a build-up of paint and it started to push itself into that drying paint, that area there where it dried quicker. So I hope that was helpful and explains why we get cauliflowers as well. So I'm going to start painting a graduated wash. As you can see already, there's a watercolor bead to that left-hand side. So start the right hand side here, collect that bead, have your painting on a slight tilt so you get that watercolor bead and you know you've got enough paint on your brush to avoid any streaking. And cauliflowers. A graduated wash is when you start with a darker wash at the top and you gradually get lighter towards the bottom, or vice versa. It's great for skies and for creating depth in watercolour. So if you were painting the distant land, you might want to start off with a lighter wash and then gradually get darker as it comes to the foreground to create depth. What I usually end up doing is I'll use just the plain water from my water pot, as I'm doing now, taking the excess off, making sure the consistency is the same, because I don't want any backruns, wet washes running into a damp or drying wash. So as you can see there, it's paling towards, let's say it's the horizon, and it's a nice way of, just starting off with these basic techniques in watercolor and, creating these different sort of washes, and it hopefully will aid and build your confidence in watercolor as well. So a variegated wash is when you use several colors and blend them in a wash. So I'm starting off with an ultramarine. It's great for sunsets, as you can imagine. So I've got my watercolor bead there, so that means I've got plenty of paint. If there's not a watercolor bead there, you are not using enough paint, or you might need to tilt your painting slightly to have it. So I'm just using water now to blend that a little. As I go into my sort of pinky colour here, loading the brush, hopefully the same consistency as the blue there. So it's blending through, and sort of I'm tilting as well, because you can see my watercolour bead there, I'm tilting. And I'm kind of working left to right, right to left, or the best I can, but just keeping an eye on the paint. And I'm rinsing my brush now. And I'm going to really load it with lots of yellow and sort of go over 50-50 the previous wash, as I did with the flat wash before. And I'm sort of working my way down now. Again, think of a sunset and you're working your way down towards the horizon. I'm just using water now to pale that yellow down towards the horizon there. So it sort of almost disappears, still trying to keep the consistency the same. So it's really good practice if you're a beginner to try out these 3 different washes: the flat wash, the graduated wash, and the variegated wash. So this is an example tutorial about working light into dark, working wet into wet, damp into wet, damp into damp, and wet on dry. So I'm going to put into practice all of these techniques. So first of all, I'm painting wet into wet. This is a simple landscape scene, and I'll put a link in the description below of the entire tutorial from start to finish. But as you can see here, I'm just using clean water and wetting all of the painting, and I've sketched out a very simple outline with my HB pencil onto rough 300 grams watercolour paper, approximately 7 by 9 inches. I'm only using 2 colours. It really helps just to use a limited palette, especially when you're starting out in watercolour. This is watery paint. It's a very dilute orange. I'm using a size 10 brush, and I'm just painting in this orange wet into wet in the sky and in the water. And the orange in the sky is reflected in the water. I've now got some indigo mixed up, again quite watery, and I'm painting the top part of the sky. It's a wet on wet wash still, and it's kind of graded as well, graduated, so it's getting paler as it goes towards the horizon to create depth. So I'm using that graduated wash here, and I'm actually painting wet into wet in the water area, slightly milkier paint here just to build up a darker tonal value there, still keeping that orange coming through, working wet into wet. I'm going to paint some clouds, dark clouds in the sky now, damp into damp. I'm mixing the indigo and the orange together to get this lovely sort of kind of dark brown colour, and I'm painting this damp into damp, just tickling it into the sky. Some areas of the sky are wet, so it's a bit more damp into wet. So where you see the paint spreading out quickly, that means that the sky area underneath is quite wet, and if it doesn't travel as quickly, it means the sky area underneath is damp. So it's a good time now to allow the painting to dry. As you can see there, my clouds have got lovely soft edges. What I'm doing now is I'm painting wet on dry, so I'm going to have crisp hard edges which are going to be pulled away from that sky, and that's why the hard edges are very useful, and it creates depth in your painting. This is a kind of a milky wash, but it's a stronger in tonal values than the first wash, and I've also used a bit of variegation, so there's a slight change in colour as well, and I've painted the foreground with a dry brush effect, wet on dry, so that really brings that foreground forward with that texture. Again, it's a good time to allow the painting to dry, and I'm building up now this tonal value, still using the 2 colour mixes, but mostly indigo here with my size 10 brush, and I'm using a flat wash, and it's a sort of a mid-tone. As you can see, it pulls away from those background hills there quite effectively, so the consistency is milky, and it creates that stronger tonal value, not just by having a milky wash, but also you've got the underpainting, so you're building up tonal values by using a glazing technique as well. So what I'm doing now is I'm adding a little bit more of the dry brush technique, and I'm going to allow my painting to dry again. And once your painting is dry, you can start building up even darker tones, and this is a creamier mixture here, working wet on dry with my size 10 brush. And again, look how that pulls away from that sort of middle distant mountain there with that dark colour. But if you notice, you can still see the kind of light of the paper being reflected through. That's really important because you don't want your painting to look flat. So I'm going to finish off this foreground area with the darks and details. Again, a link for this full version of this tutorial can be found in the description below, but it's just to give you an example of building light to dark, using those different washes, working wet on dry, wet into wet, damp into damp, and it just shows you how beneficial those different techniques are and when to kind of use them. And I'm just finishing off here, wet on dry, dry brush with my darkest tonal value there. Before I discuss the extras that you can buy and add to your watercolour equipment, I just want to let you know I've included beginner playlists in the description below to help you continue your watercolour journey So I hope you find this helpful. So I'm just going to talk about some extra materials you might want to add to your equipment. I've got a triple trio water pot here, which I really like. It's handy, but you can actually make your own water pots. And one of them is just to recycle an old plastic bottle and cut it in half. There's lots of different ways you can do this. Obviously, I love my trio pot there. I use washi tape, masking tape, to tape down my watercolour paper, and it also creates a really nice white border. But you can start off with masking tape if you like, but washi tape's quite nice and it's very kind to the watercolour paper as well. I like to use an HB pencil. It's not too soft and it's not too hard, so it doesn't smudge and it doesn't scratch. And I just sharpen it with a pencil sharp and I'm good to go. I also like using natural sponges, but you can use a scourer even. I'm just demonstrating sponge technique here very briefly, mixing up a big wash of creamy watercolour. I've wet my sponge, rinsed it, wrung all the water out, and I'm tapping now this creamy paint onto, you can either do it onto a wet surface or a dry surface, depending on what sort of effect you like. It's great for trees. And so if you see any on your sort of around about shopping, you can find this at a pharmacy or an art shop. I'd pick up a natural sponge. I also love using plastic cards. These are just store cards or old bank cards cut up into different sizes. My best bit of advice is don't use too watery paint, use it quite creamy. We spoke about the creamy paint. So you mix up your colours here. I'm painting this wet on dry, this creamy paint, and I'm going to use the card now to lift off the paint. So the green paint here, I'm just using it to lift off thin lines, and this creates the look of grasses, all sorts of different things. Make sure the shine is still there, but it's not too wet, and do practice it. But it's so useful and it's fun to do. You can also print with the card, the side of the card there, to make sort of dark lines as well. So for something that doesn't cost anything, it is a great watercolor tool. I'm using it to create rocks here. You can see I'm swiping, so the paint's not too wet, but it lifts off and it creates texture and darks and lights as well, and it's so much fun to do. So do have a little practice of that. Remember, don't have the paint too wet. I'm showing you there that swiping, not too, don't drag, swipe. It's so much fun to do, and I'm sort of just lifting off some grasses there as well, and tapping and printing with the card. I also like spattering. That's loading my brush, holding it firmly in my painting hand and tapping it in the middle of the brush. Using sea salt or table salt is another fun thing to do with watercolor. It doesn't cost very much. I'm sprinkling some salt onto damp watercolor paper here to create some exciting effects. I'll have a link in the description below of a more in-depth tutorial on using salt. But just to say, it creates the most amazing textures. As you can see here, they are still drying, but you can see it lifts off the paint and it sort of has these little explosions of light and sort of crinkly edges, and it looks like wildflowers. Another really inexpensive tool is a wax crayon or a wax candle. You can rub it onto your watercolor paper. It resists the paint, as you can see here. Just painting that on, it's great for sort of creating the texture in water and on walls as well. So it's always handy to have a plastic eraser. You can use a putty rubber, but I prefer a plastic one. They are actually cheaper as well, and they're really good at getting off pencil lines as long as you haven't got any watercolor washes over them. And my tip is, before you start painting, sort of rub out your pencil lines so you can just see ghost lines, so they don't sort of come forward too much in your watercolor painting. A really good thing to have when you're starting out in watercolor and you're a beginner is some white gouache. It has rescued many of my paintings, but also my students' paintings. It's great for sort of getting a bit of light that you may have lost during your painting process. So it's always nice to have a tube of white gouache in your watercolor box. And last but not least, masking fluid. I do use it a lot in my watercolor paintings to reserve the light and white of the watercolor paper. Here is a jar of blue masking fluid, which I find is the best, so you can see what you're doing with it. The clearer masking fluids, it's difficult to see where you've actually masked. The most important thing is to dip your brush into hand liquid soap. It protects the brush while you're using the masking fluid. You can use other tools to apply masking fluid as well, but I'm applying it here to reserve the light and white of the paper. And once you finish using your masking fluid, you rinse your brush, and the brush should be as good as new. But I would use an old brush. Don't use your good watercolor brushes. And the other thing is always allow your painting to dry naturally. Don't blow dry masking fluid because it's very tricky to remove if heat has been applied to dry it. But once you have finished drying your masking fluid naturally and you put a watercolor wash on and you want to dry it with a hairdryer, you can do so because the masking fluid is already dry. It doesn't seem to affect it. To remove masking fluid, make sure your painting is completely dry. If there's any dampness in the paper and you try to remove it, it can smudge your painting or tear your paper. So I hope that's helpful, and I will put a link in the description below of a tutorial I made all about using masking fluid. So I really hope you found this tutorial helpful, especially if you're a beginner starting out in watercolour. It can be so daunting just sort of sifting through the right papers, right brushes, right paints, and the basic sort of techniques as well. And I hope you like the extras. I absolutely love sort of playing around with the different sort of watercolour techniques. It really builds confidence. If you have any questions about this tutorial, please put them in the comments section below. And if you'd like to see more tutorials like this, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel where you'll get updates of my latest videos. And if you'd like to learn more about watercolour painting, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? You will get access to exclusive tutorials, more in-depth tutorials, downloadable sketches, and they are ad-free. So if you have any questions about that, please put them in the comments section below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.